Is the government looking to expand the pool of people who can be denaturalized in the U.S.? So, we've got a new bill introduced in both the Senate and the House called the Fraud Accountability Act, which is looking to expand the scope of denaturalization. In this video, we're going to go over exactly what the bill is doing. So, how it's expanding denaturalization and who it would apply to. We're also going to cover just practical thoughts and considerations about this bill. If you haven't watched any of our other videos on denaturalization, please check those out, because in this video, we're not going to go over denaturalization and the whole process of denaturalization in detail, because we've done that in many videos. We're recording this video to provide an update because we know so many have reached out about this bill. We know many of you are already anxious. So, the goal here is just to clarify what this bill is saying and provide our thoughts about it. First and foremost, welcome back to U.S. Citizenship and Visa. This channel helps foreign nationals navigate the U.S. legal system, including work on denaturalization cases. So, hopefully we can shine some light and provide some explanations regarding this bill that you find helpful. If you like the video and the channel and the content, please subscribe and like the video, and that way you're going to get updates for any future videos that we upload. That being said, let's jump right into today's topic of discussion, which is the Fraud Accountability Act, which was introduced in both the Senate and the House as a response to the recent daycare fraud scandal that has happened. Now, while it addresses fraud and punishment for fraud, a lot of the bill itself is focused on immigration consequences for the individuals committing the fraud. So, the biggest change that it brings to the immigration rules is that under this bill, someone can be denaturalized for fraud committed after becoming a U.S. citizen. So right now, the way denaturalization works is that one can be denaturalized generally for illegally procuring U.S. citizenship. So there was a technical error, and they should have never been granted U.S. citizenship. Or if they committed fraud or made a material misrepresentation in the naturalization process. So essentially, if there was a lie in the process of becoming a U.S. citizen. But any acts after one becomes a U.S. citizen, for those one can be punished in criminal court. Right. But through the criminal justice system. But denaturalization is not a punishment for crimes committed after becoming a U.S. citizen. Now this bill, it would change that. And it essentially would allow, and in some cases, mandate, and we're going to go over that in a second, denaturalization of naturalized U.S. citizens who have committed fraud. So it's a huge difference, because it doesn't only apply to actions before becoming a U.S. citizen, but in fact uses denaturalization as a punishment for acts committed after becoming a U.S. citizen. So the way the bill achieves this is by removing the civil court process from denaturalization. So the criminal court in which the individual is convicted of fraud, that same court is mandated with immediately proceeding with denaturalization. So once the criminal conviction of fraud is entered against someone within that criminal process, the individual would also be denaturalized. Which is a huge difference because right now, most denaturalization handled by most denaturalization cases heard by courts are in civil court, and it's a civil process. It's not part of the criminal proceedings for any conviction. The most interesting and perhaps scary part of all of this is that the way the bill is worded is that the judge would be required to denaturalize someone in these cases. So if there is a conviction, the bill says the judge shall denaturalize someone. So it's a requirement without any discussions or leniency. It mandates denaturalization if there is a fraud conviction against someone. Interestingly, the bill also lowers the threshold for fraud. So, the way it's written, it's fraud committed against private individuals, funds, corporations, or the government. And it removes the $10,000 threshold that is currently in place for fraud to be considered an aggravated felony. So what this means is that currently, in order for a fraud offense to be considered an aggravated felony and generally lead to deportability and deportation proceedings against a permanent resident, the fraud conviction generally has to have a $10,000, like the fraud has to be in the amount of $10,000 or more. Now in this bill, this particular amount is removed and it just says fraud, which means any fraud would satisfy this requirement. So what the bill does by removing this threshold, it for permanent residents, so we're not talking about citizens. Permanent residents, if they commit any fraud, they can be deported for any fraud, not only significant severe fraud for major monetary amounts. And for those who are naturalized U.S. citizens, if they're convicted of any fraud, not just above $10,000, they can, or the way it's written, the judge has to denaturalize them as part of that conviction. And the way the bill does this is by expanding or changing the definitions in Section 237A2 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which deals with deportability, and then deportable offenses or offenses to render someone deportable. What's fascinating here from the legal side is that generally deportable offenses in this concept, these concepts, apply to non-U.S. citizens. So, permanent residents, those here in other statuses, right? Or no status. But by changing these definitions and bringing them into the fold of naturalized citizens and denaturalization, all of a sudden the deportability sections of the Immigration and Nationality Act are being applied to U.S. citizens, which is something that has never been done, and it's just not how the Act and the laws operate today at all. U.S. citizens cannot be deported. Non-citizens can be deported. And then finally, what the bill does is that it will apply retroactively to September 30th, 1996. So almost 30 years of going back in time. So if anyone was convicted of fraud, and again it's the lesser threshold of fraud, since September 30th, 1996, this bill could apply, and they could be deported if they're permanent resident or denaturalized if they're U.S. citizen. So before we go into sort of the legality of all this and our thoughts, the first thing that we want to remind everyone of is that there's a lot of bills introduced in Congress. So just because the bill is introduced, that doesn't mean it will ever become law. And these bills, both in the House and the Senate, very much seem to be a reaction to this fraud scandal that has happened. And essentially, it's congressmen reacting to it and trying to show their constituents that they're trying to look out for them. They want to prevent fraud, etc. And that's what leads to bills like this from being introduced. Now, just because a bill is introduced, it doesn't mean it will ever become law, and even less so does it mean that it's law today. So it's just very important to remember this, that this bill is essentially in committee right now for discussion. It is very, very far from becoming law. So on the legal side, there's several issues with this bill as it is written today. So first and foremost, there is a Supreme Court precedent case, Afroyim v. Rusk, which held that a U.S. citizen's citizenship cannot be taken away by Congress unless they voluntarily renounce it. Well, this bill is trying to do exactly that, creating a mechanism to take away U.S. citizens' U.S. citizenship in certain situations. So there would definitely be legal challenges based on the Afroyim v. Rusk case and its protections for U.S. citizens. Another issue with this bill is that it creates two classes of U.S. citizens. You have your natural-born U.S. citizens whose citizenship cannot be taken away. No matter what kind of fraud they commit, even if it's millions of dollars, they cannot be denaturalized. And then you have your second class of U.S. citizens, the naturalized U.S. citizens whose citizenship can be taken away if they committed fraud. So it creates kind of like a conditional citizen class that sits in between permanent residence and full-born, natural-born citizenship in the middle. Now the issue with this is that this will create equal protection issues because of the separation of U.S. citizens into classes and differentiating between the types of U.S. citizens, and this would violate the established principles in another important precedent case, Schneider v. Rusk, which upheld equal protection principles for citizens. So essentially outlawing this creation of different classes of U.S. citizens. So there would be legal challenges onto this bill based on that separate equal protection legal precedent as well. And we think it's because of this Schneider v. Rusk case, which was decided in 1964. So it's precedent going back 60-plus years. In that case, the court held that naturalized U.S. citizens possess the same rights as natural-born U.S. citizens, except the ability to become presidents of the United States. But besides that, essentially all citizens possess the same rights. So by creating this conditional citizen class, which this bill does create, because one set of citizens can be denaturalized for fraud committed after becoming U.S. citizens, another set of citizens cannot be denaturalized ever because they were born in the country. By creating these two classes, we just don't see how it doesn't violate that precedent decision that holds that essentially the government cannot create two classes of citizens and treat citizens differently from one another. So because of that, we don't see how this bill would survive challenges. To be really honest, we're not convinced this bill will ever become law, simply because we think there's so many issues with it, and the definition of fraud is so incredibly broad. And what What if you know someone has done something relatively minor, and they get convicted of quote-unquote fraud, and then it has such terrible consequences for them? So the bottom line is, we do find it scary that more and more our government is treating denaturalization like deportation. They're completely separate concepts, right? Non-citizens can be deported if they commit certain offenses. Citizens cannot be deported for offenses they've committed. So all of these bills and all of this discussion about denaturalization is essentially turning denaturalization into a form of punishment, right? Which is reserved for the criminal justice system rather than the immigration system, right? So punishment occurs as part of the criminal justice system. So if a naturalized U.S. citizen commits a crime, then they'll be punished for that crime under the criminal justice system. So it does worry us that more and more there's conversations about turning the immigration system into a system of punishment for U.S. citizens who became naturalized U.S. citizens. But again, we're not convinced at all that this bill would ever become law. And most importantly, if it does become law, we think the legal challenges. There's two critical precedent decisions that don't allow this bill to do what it's trying to do. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments about this, post them in the comment section below, and we'll do our best to record more videos like this one. Thank you for watching U.S. Citizenship and Visa. Stay informed, stay protected.